Hello everyone, welcome back to Canada, the Illusion of Freedom and System of Control. Today we're just going to do an overview of the British North America Act 1867, now known as the Constitution Act 1867, and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We're going to be exposing the fraud and deceit, and hopefully it will spark some questions and ignite some reactions. With any luck, this information will inspire you to use the links I provide, do your own research, develop your own level of knowledge and understanding, and then pay it forward. Teach someone else. Because things in our world are never going to change for the better until the truth about the world comes out and it's corrected lawfully, legally, and peacefully by the people. That being said, let's jump right on in. We're going to start off with the Criminal Code of Canada, Section 19, Ignorance of the Law. Ignorance of the law by a person who commits an offense is not an excuse for committing that offense. There's that word again, person. We're not going to go into definitions again. We've covered that extensively. However, it is important to remember our maxim of law, expressio unius est exclusio alterius. The inclusion of one excludes all others when we're thinking about the word person, and through the Interpretation Act, we know it means a corporation. But it's important to recognize the inclusion of one thing excludes all others. I always like to look at Government of Canada websites to see what they're actually saying about the government, the system of justice, the history of Canada, and how they're perpetuating the fraud. That being said, there's also little interesting tidbits of information that they put in these documents. Now, in their legal system, they have to leave us remedy. They have to leave us a way out. It's part of their system of fairness, I guess. But they don't necessarily have to tell us what that remedy is. It's up to us to figure it out. And once again, ignorance of the law by a person who commits an offense is not an excuse for committing that offense. They expect us to know the laws that govern us, but they use nefarious tactics to ensure that we are ignorant. Because we don't know legalese, we don't know maxims of law that are used in the construction, the creation, and interpretation of statutes. We don't know any of these things. So how can we be, and we're not taught, so how can we be anything but ignorant? Which is exactly the way they want us. This guide explains the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Charter, and its importance in the daily lives of Canadians. This content is not legal advice and should not be taken as legal interpretation of the provisions of this charter. The legal interpretation. when they write these guides and documents, they write them in common usage understanding. More deception, more nefarious tactics and trickery. All right, moving along. What is the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms? The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms sets out those rights and freedoms that Canadians believe are necessary in a free and democratic society. The Charter is one part of the Canadian Constitution. The Constitution is a set of laws containing the basic rules about how our country operates. For example, it states the powers of the federal and provincial and territorial governments in Canada. A very interesting little choice of words is Canadians believe that our rights and freedoms are necessary in a free and democratic society. Certainly Canadians believe that, but given the fraud, deception, and evidence through their own acts and statutes, through the unlawful conversion of the human being to the artificial person or corporation in the birth certificate, we can see it's very clear that the Canadian government does not believe that fundamental rights and freedoms are necessary in a free and democratic society, because right in the Charter it says despite your fundamental freedoms and legal rights, the government can write a new law that can take them away. So it's very obvious that the government does not believe in rights and freedoms. Moving right along. How does the Charter work with other Canadian laws? The Constitution is the supreme law of Canada. All other laws must be consistent with the rules set out in it. If they are not, they may not be valid. Since the Charter is part of the Constitution, it is the most important law that we have in Canada. However, the rights and freedoms in the Charter are not absolute. They can be limited to protect other rights or important national values. So they're telling you that Canadians believe it's necessary to establish and respect our rights and freedoms as natural-born human beings. But it's very obvious, it says right here, they're not absolute. So they do not agree that they are part of a free and democratic society, which is another topic altogether, the democratic society. So they're inadvertently giving us clues that we have to figure out for ourselves. The Constitution Act 1867. Now, once again, through the Canada Act, the de facto Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, wrote the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It was written by the government, for the government, under the illusion that it was for the people. And in 1982, he changed the name from the British North America Act to the Constitution Act. Once again, fraud and deception, the illusion of freedom. I'm not going to cover the fraud in the preamble. We've already covered that in previous videos. However, I want to revisit the footnotes included in the Constitution Act 1867. Our first footnote is very, very important. When you're reading statute law, it's very important to read the footnotes because they hide very important information in the footnotes. So number one, the enacting clause was repealed by the Statute Law Revision Act 1893 by Queen Victoria and the UK Parliament. It read as follows: "Be it therefore enacted and declared by the Queen's most excellent Majesty, and by and with the advice and consent of the Lords Spiritual and Temporal and Commons in this present Parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same as follows." When you repeal an act or statute or a provision of an act or statute, it is of no more force or effect. It's no longer law. We can see that it's not included in the Constitution Act 1867 anymore, but it is included down here in the footnotes. They count on us not reading the footnotes. Another very important footnote that happened at the same time through the Statute Law Revision Act of 1893 was Section 2 was repealed. The provisions of this act referring to Her Majesty the Queen extend also to her heirs, as Justin Trudeau would say, and successors of Her Majesty, kings, queens of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The provisions of the British North America Act referring to the Queen extending to her heirs and successors was repealed in 1893. Queen Victoria, who gave this Statute Law Revision Act royal assent, died in 1901. Before she died, she repealed the enacting clause of the BNA Act, and she also removed the provisions of the BNA extending to her heirs and successors. Now, if you go back and you look, take out all monarchs, kings and queens after Queen Victoria, after 1901, and you look at the provisions regarding the Queen, those are gone because those provisions were repealed in 1893, as well as the enacting clause. So the entire BNA was no longer enacted. And if you look down at executive power, Section 9, Declaration of Executive Power in the Queen, the executive government and authority of and over Canada is hereby declared to continue to be vested in the Queen. That was in 1867. In 1893, the provisions of the BNA no longer extended to the heirs and successors of Queen Victoria. So the BNA was no longer enacted, and any provisions in executive power by the Queen ended with Queen Victoria in 1901. Fraud and deception. Moving on to our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This is part of the Constitution Act 1982. When we think about this, a de facto government and Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, wrote the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for the government, by the government, with no lawful authority, then took that document to a foreign monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, who signed off on it, again with no authority, and presented it to the people of Canada as our guarantee of fundamental rights, fundamental freedoms, and legal rights. The fraud is absolutely astounding. That being said, our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, whereas Canada is founded upon the principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. That's right. Our inherent duty, do no harm. Pretty simple. Guarantee of rights and freedoms. Rights and freedoms in Canada. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. That sounds wonderful. Nowhere in our Constitution and Charter of Rights and Freedoms will you see the words "we the people," because neither were written by the people for the people. They were written by the government for the government. All based on fraud and deception. I'm not going to go through all of our fundamental freedoms and legal rights. Section 2, it's important to remember that Section 2 pertains to fundamental freedoms. And down here, legal rights from Section 7 to 15. Once again, I'll let you on your own time read through that for the sake of keeping this video to a reasonable time limit. But we will take a quick look at some other provisions in the Charter. Number 32, application of the Charter. This Charter applies to the Parliament and Government of Canada in respect to all matters within the authority of Parliament, including all matters relating to the Yukon Territory and Northwest Territories, and to the legislature and government of each province in respect to all matters within the authority of the legislature of each province. So it clearly states that the Charter only applies to the government and the legislature and government of the provinces and territories. Now, the legal eagles out there will say, of course, it's meant to protect the people from the government, to limit the government's powers over the people. That's what we're led to believe. But if we move to Section 52, we will come to another discovery. The primacy of Constitution of Canada. The Constitution of Canada is the supreme law of Canada, and any law that is inconsistent with the provisions of the Constitution is, to the extent of the inconsistency, of no force or effect. The Constitution and the Charter is the supreme law of Canada, and anything inconsistent is of no force or effect. Well, we know, looking back at Section 32, that it applies only to the Government of Canada. All other laws are written under the Constitution and Charter, which applies only to the Government of Canada. So how does the Criminal Code of Canada apply to the people of Canada? That's a good question for an interesting discussion with lawyers. Moving right along. Oh, I almost forgot. another important provision. I skipped right by it, unfortunately. Whoops, we got to go back a page. And we were just, once again, we were just discussing who the charter applies to, the government and the legislature and government of each province. And we saw that in the preamble it says that the charter guarantees our fundamental freedoms and legal rights. But then we look at section 33. And it says, Parliament or the legislature of a province may expressly declare in an act of Parliament or of the legislature, as the case may be, that the act or a provision thereof shall operate, notwithstanding a provision included in Section 2 or Section 7-15 of this charter. So there you go. It says, here's your guaranteed fundamental freedoms and legal rights, but down here in section 33 it says notwithstanding, so despite anything in section 2 under your fundamental freedoms or sections 7-15, your legal rights, they can all be taken away through a new law written by Parliament or the legislature. Is that freedom? Are those rights, if they can be taken away through an act of Parliament? Or are they privileges that are granted and can be taken away? Rights cannot be given away. You cannot give away your rights. They can be taken away through force or deception, through violence. The only thing we can do with our rights is choose not to exercise them. Freedom of choice, free will. But right here, it says, despite your fundamental freedoms or your legal rights, an act of Parliament shall operate. Just amazing. We could spend a full 8-hour day breaking down the BNA and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's just, the fraud is just astronomical and astounding. So there we have, the Constitution is the supreme law. It applies only to the government, and any law that's inconsistent, which is written under the Constitution and the Charter, is of no force or effect. So the Highway Traffic Act, the Criminal Code, all of that, it applies only to the government. Now moving down, here's a couple more sections that most people aren't aware of and they do not talk about. 58. Subject to Section 59, this act shall come into force on a day to be fixed by proclamation issued by the Queen or the Governor-General under the Great Seal of Canada. Okay, we see we have another footnote. And Section 59. Commencement of paragraph 23 1A in respect of Quebec. 59. Paragraph 23 1A shall come into force in respect of Quebec on a day to be fixed by proclamation issued by the Queen or the Governor-General under the Great Seal of Canada. Okay, that's pretty easy to understand. So, subject to Section 59. Depending on Section 59, this act shall come into effect by proclamation issued by the Queen or the Governor General. Now let's have a look at our footnote. That sound in the background, by the way, it's a snoring beagle, and I do apologize. And when we read our footnote here, the Act, with the exception of paragraph 23(1)(a) in respect of Quebec, came into force on April 17, 1982 by proclamation issued by the Queen. Right here. All of us that are old enough to remember how this was promoted as the greatest day in Canada and our freedom from Great Britain and yada, 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 yada. Our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, all that good stuff. But we can see subject to, depending on Section 59, the Act will come into force. 59 never happened. 23(1)(a) never came into force, and there was not a proclamation issued by the Queen or the Governor General under the Great Seal of Canada. Therefore, this Act is of no force or effect, because subject to Section 59, the requirements of Section 59 were not met, depending on Section 59. There's another fraud and deception for everyone to witness. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, these aren't my words. These are Acts and Statutes from the UK and Canadian government. It's right there for us to discover. Educate ourselves and educate everyone else. All the truth is right here. It's all right here. How can you dispute their laws? How can they dispute their laws? And if our fundamental freedoms and legal rights are granted, they can be taken away. And we can see that through the wording of the statutes. They say it in Section 33. Despite any fundamental freedoms or legal rights, we can just take them away at our own discretion, at our whim, disregarding the will of the people. Whoops. And now, more evidence is the Criminal Code of Canada. Once again, I've just illustrated how it doesn't apply, but in the beginning I said they need to leave us remedy. And more proof of that remedy is Section 15 in the Criminal Code of Canada, obedience to de facto law. No person shall be convicted of an offense in respect to an act or omission in obedience to the laws for the time being made and enforced by persons in de facto possession of the sovereign power in and over the place where the act or omission occurs. Enforced, being made or enforced by persons in de facto possession of the sovereign power. Who is the sovereign power? The people of Canada. Not the government, not the Queen, the people. The people created the government to serve the people. The government didn't create the people to serve the government. However, it did create the person, the corporation, to serve the government. Fraud and deception. The illusion of freedom in a system of control. Now, for those of you that may not know what de facto means, again, more legalese to keep us ignorant. Let's have a look at Black's Law Dictionary. In fact, indeed, actually. This phrase is used to characterize an officer, a government, a past action, or a state of affairs which exist actually and must be accepted for all practical purposes, but which is illegal or illegitimate. In this sense, it is contrary of de jure, which means rightful, legitimate, just, or constitutional. So de facto means it exists, but it is illegal or illegitimate. And further description, we can see, thus an officer, king, or government de facto is one who is in actual possession of the office or supreme power, but by usurpation. That's exactly what happened. The Canadian government was de facto, null and void. It started back in 1893 with the Statute Law Revisions Act, which gave the Queen the authority to form the Canadian government. And then again, on December 11th, 1931, after the passing of the Statute of Westminster, the sovereign power went back to the provinces. Every province became a sovereign nation with no government that was elected by the people. The government was created by the crown for the crown, not by the crown for the people. And as I've covered in previous videos, the Canadian government fully now admits we didn't exercise the autonomy granted under the Statute of Westminster because it was too tough to figure out constitutional questions. That's their excuse, and I've covered it. I've shown you on their own website in their own words. But right here in the criminal code, here's more evidence. No person shall be convicted of an offense made or enforced by persons in de facto possession of the sovereign power. There you go. And to further this evidence, we can have a look at a couple of Supreme Court cases. I'm not going to go through the entire case, but there's some very important decisions and conclusions made by the Supreme Court. And here's one. However, it cannot be said that in conducting a brief investigation detention, the bouncer was acting as a delegate of the government, carrying out its policies and programs. Accordingly, the charter does not apply to the actions of the bouncer in detaining Dell. It says right there, the charter does not apply to the actions of the bouncer, a private person. And through the case, it describes the bouncer as a private person. In summary, unlike citizen's arrest, investigative detention cannot be reasonably construed to be a specific government function that has been delegated to private citizens. And another example, application of the charter to interactions between private citizens. Although 32 of the Charter limits its applications to Parliament, legislatures, and provincial and federal governments. When the Charter was first introduced, there was some debate about its application. Well, I guess there was. It's written right in there. Since that time, the law has been settled that as a general rule, the Charter only applies to government actions, not interactions between private citizens or institutions. And it states a whole bunch of cases. More evidence that it applies to governments, because it's admiralty law, and law between human beings is common law of the people, law of the land, not law of corporations and artificial persons. And here they're citing another case. Buhay recognized two exceptions to the general rule that the Charter does not apply to interactions between private citizens. The first is when a private citizen acts as an agent of the state. You're working for the government. Your social insurance number and your birth certificate. The private person, the artificial person, the corporation, working for the Corporation of Canada. The agent of the state analysis requires an examination of the relationship between the state and the private individual alleged to have acted as an agent of the state. When you are walking around, going to work, living your life, are you aware that you're acting as an agent of the state if you're using your birth certificate, your driver's license, your social insurance number? Otherwise, we can see right here in Supreme Court decisions that the Charter doesn't apply to us. The Charter's the supreme law of Canada. All other laws are written under the Constitution and Charter, and if they're inconsistent, they're of no force or effect. And the Charter only applies to the government of Canada and the government and legislatures of the provinces. We can see down here the second exception to the general rule that the Charter does not apply between private individuals occurs when a private person can be categorized as part of government because he or she is performing a specific government function. Taxpayer, the court noted that the Charter will only apply to a private entity if it is found to be implementing a specific government policy or program. The court in Buhay observed that this exception would apply if there were an express delegation of a public function to a private person, or if the state were to abandon in whole or in part an essential public function to the private sector. We can see, again, ladies and gentlemen, this is not me. It's through their own statutes and through the Supreme Court. Why doesn't it apply to private people? Because private people are human beings. And this law, banking, commerce, artificial person, legal fiction, corporate law, doesn't apply to human beings. It's not even recognized in this. Human beings are not recognized in this jurisdiction, in admiralty, maritime, Roman law, in banking and commercial law. We're not even recognized. Well, I hope that once again this information has inspired you to dig deeper, do your own research, develop your own level of knowledge and understanding, and then teach someone else. I thank you for your time and hope you will continue to watch for my videos. Subscribe if you like. Please comment. And in the next video, I'm going to talk about solutions. There are groups out there globally that are working on global solutions because these problems are global. We're all under basically the same system. And it all stems from fraud and deceit and capitis diminutio maxima. When the human being, the baby, is born and unlawfully converted into an artificial person, a corporation, which is then forced to apply for a social insurance number, our government employee ID number, which puts us into this jurisdiction, unbeknownst to us. Does that sound like the rule of law, or does that sound like the color of law? I'll leave you all once again with my favorite quote. None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. Are you free? Or have you been hopelessly enslaved because you falsely believe you are free through fraud and deception? Thanks for watching. Stay safe, everyone, and remember, do no harm.